The delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we get very quickly and very easily cynical serving in these roles sometimes. I'm sure the public shares some cynicism with politics most of the time, which is why it was even more difficult for me to witness what I watched last night from the governor, because in the midst of all the cynicism that abounds in politics, I personally sincerely hoped that we were about to hear new and different things and a different tone from the governor as it relates to bipartisan outreach last night. And I mean that. I was personally disappointed, and I mean that not at all by way of political posturing. I legitimately thought, based on what I knew about the man, Ralph Northam, that Governor Northam would be different. And I still hope that's the case. But I had no indication of it last night that it would be. That speech was so partisan that some of us remarked to one another that he must have found it in the drawer of his predecessor and just decided to go ahead and give the speech nonetheless. The remarks I gave on this floor yesterday were sincere. There are diametrically opposed worldviews that are represented in this body that are reflective of our society at large. But that doesn't mean that there are not places where we can find opportunities to work together. I have a list of things that we just thought of this morning, about 20 things that could have been the focus of the governor's speech last night. And granted, he had a right at his inauguration to do a victory lap and check off boxes for advocacy groups that helped him get where he is. But he just doubled down last night to the pleasure of donors and advocacy groups. He made those partisan issues the absolute singular focus of his speech. And those 18 or 20 things that we were able to find that he could have talked about were left either unmentioned or with a passing reference. I think it's important to remember to advise the governor, our members across the aisle, and the members of the media that the notion of bipartisanship and the definition of bipartisanship is not Republicans doing what Democrats want. I think we largely get slapped with that definition from time to time. In fact, repeatedly, it seems like that is the definition we are faced with. Why don't you do what we want and be bipartisan? That's a two-way street. I don't think we get there. I don't think we bridge the divide on the things that truly separate us in our worldview. But again, there are innumerable things that we could focus on for good government, to help our citizens, to make life better, where we can find common ground. That was my invitation yesterday, that could be the focus of this session. If that is not the governor's intention, then he will allow his words from last night to just continue to ring with no correction. If he truly intends to make good on his singular reference to bipartisanship that he made in his speech last night, where he purported to be thankful that that was the watchword of the day. If he truly wants that, then there are ample opportunities for him to demonstrate and to articulate that that is his intention. I think last night was a missed opportunity. And I don't know who's in the governor's ear. And I know there are people who are left over from the previous administration who may have his ear or who may be writing his speeches. But I continue to maintain that the man we think we know is at the helm of our state government could be different and could reach across the partisan divide, if only he can get away from those who continue to clamor for him to set the agenda he set out last night. So we look for opportunities. We stand ready to do that. We have had not a single indication from the governor since his election that he is ready to do that. And so we look forward to that if that is his intention. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Charlottesville, Delegate Toscano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I appreciate the words of my friend, the gentleman from Shenandoah. And we're all processing the governor's first address to the Joint Assembly, and I hope that as we process it, we remember a couple of things. First, he was one of us. So he understands the give and take of politics. And he understands that sometimes you have to lay down your markers because that's what you stand for. Those are your principles. And it's perfectly appropriate for him to do so. And I think he understands that once you lay down those markers, then you got to try to find common ground. Now, last night, he laid down a number of markers. Some of them you may like, and some of them you may not like. But he also reminded us, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a brand new General Assembly, even though the issues that he discussed are not new to the General Assembly. So we have new members in the body. And with every new General Assembly comes a hope that we can find a better way. So now the other thing I hope that we can remember is that our legislative process is not just about tone, and it's not just about words. We hear a lot of these words, and I've said them a lot myself. Bipartisanship, civility, I'm all for them. But it's about more. It's about our constituents and what they want and what their interests are, because that's why they elect us to come down here. They do care about the flowery words, and they do care about the promises of bipartisanship, but they really want more. They want us to get things done. And if we focus on their interests, we really can get things done. After all, isn't it in the interests of those we represent to create more economic opportunities for workers to get a good job to pay a living wage? I think there's probably broad bipartisan support on that, and the governor talked a lot about it in his speech. Now, we Democrats, of course, we have some different approaches than our counterparts across the aisle. This morning, we had a press conference to talk about the minimum wage and the importance of growing all wages. Now, people can disagree about that, but we laid down our marker. We want to talk about it. We'll decide how we're going to do it during the session. And isn't it in the interest of those we represent to give them access to the training to get those good jobs? I think there's broad bipartisan support on that concept of how. The question is, how are we going to do it? The governor laid out this G3 approach. Hopefully we can embrace that. We also, this morning, Democrats offered to talk about student loan debt and reducing the burden of that. I saw actually people on both sides of the aisle get up and clap for that the governor talked about in his speech. We also support a plan that will pay a portion of tuition to Virginians who pursue credentialing in high-demand fields if they will give back through some public service. That's one of our markers. We hope people will think about that. If it's not exactly the right thing that people want to do, well, maybe we can come to a compromise in a bipartisan fashion. And once our constituents have these good jobs, isn't it in their interest to try to be able to keep those jobs? So that's why the Democrats this morning put forward a proposal for anti-discrimination in hiring and in employment so that people can keep a good job. And that's why we also talked about paid family leave so that people can be with a newborn child and still keep their job without being in fear of being fired. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it in the interest of our constituents to build a world-class educational system that recruits good teachers, pays them well, and retains them? Shouldn't we invest in school divisions, both rural and urban, that are especially challenged, not just because it's in their interest, but it's the right thing to do? The governor talked about that. I think there are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who can embrace that concept. And finally, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, isn't it in the interest of those we represent and in our own interest to find a way to expand health care coverage and make it more affordable for those Virginians who need it? We understand that's a very heavy lift. That is not going to be easy. But I hear positive things about expanding health care coverage. It's not always described the way the governor described it, but it's clear. The message of this last election was Virginians want better access, and we got to figure out a way to give it to them. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, civility and bipartisanship are worthy goals, but they are not ends in and of themselves. They are simply a means to meet the needs of our citizens, to serve the interests of our constituents. Over the last few days, we've committed ourselves to bipartisanship and civility. Now it's time for this approach to bear fruit for our friends and neighbors who want and need a better life. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.